lecture in our series, Bioethics and its Impact on Our Lives. My name is Ruth Wilson. I am yet another member of the lecture committee for the adult school. Our speaker tonight probably doesn't even need to be introduced. He is a very familiar face in our community. As many of you know, Harold Shapiro served as Princeton's president from 1988 to 2001. He continues to serve the university as a professor of economics and public affairs in the Woodrow Wilson School. He came to Princeton from the University of Michigan, where he served on the faculty for 24 years as professor of economics and public policy, and as a president from 1980 to 1988. And by the way, he's not here to answer questions about economics. His undergraduate studies were at McGill University and his graduate work at Princeton. Harold Shapiro's research ranges from econometrics, mathematical economics, to the evolution of post-secondary education, science policy, and bioethics. I believe that Professor Shapiro's interest in bioethics was stimulated by his service as chair of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, beginning in 1996, although it may have started with his membership on the first President Bush's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in the early 90s. Whatever the case, he's been thinking, teaching, writing, speaking about bioethical issues for some time now. So it was natural for us to turn to him for help with this series. We are honored that he's agreed to speak. His topic is, he changed it slightly, so I'm reading it off his, Advisory Commissions and the Formation of Public Policy, bioethics. Please welcome Harold Shapiro.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here this evening. And thank you all for coming out on Thanksgiving week. I don't know what it's like outside the university, but at the university, beginning Monday of Thanksgiving week, everything seems to slow down very quickly. It was very easy to get a parking spot this morning when I came to work. But in any case, thank you all very much for coming. And needless to say, I want to thank all those people who worked so hard putting together the programs for the adult school, this one and other ones. And it's an enormous benefit for the community, and I'm very glad to be a part of it. Well, I am going to talk, as the title of this says, you can see up on the screen, about advisory commissions and the formation of public policy. The reason I'm going to talk about that is one of my long-term interests in the area of public policy has been how public policy gets formed when they are dealing with morally controversial issues. I mean, there are issues in which well-meaning, thoughtful people just disagree. Some of them are very basic issues in which they disagree, and which moral philosophy by alone really can't produce an answer which is compelling enough to both sides. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So that's where my interest has always, not always, but for the last couple of decades has fallen. And how it got into bioethics as a subset of that is almost an accidental story. And I don't even know the whole story because I've only been able to sort of ferret it out little by little over the years. But I was, as was said, chairman of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission during a good part of the Clinton administration. And that's certainly when I began thinking very seriously about these kind of problems. So I'm going to talk about a few things tonight. One thing is going to be about giving advice to the government. What role does that play in our society? What role has it played in bioethics and bioethical concerns? And what do we mean by giving advice to government, and who it is that does give advice to the government, and how we're supposed to think of that? So the first thing is advising the government. That's the first part of the talk. I have almost a kind of genetic requirement to turn around and look at this thing to make sure it's there, although I know it's there because I'm looking directly at it here. But having taught for most of my career with a blackboard, I was always having to turn. So if I seem to turn unnecessarily to look at that, please forgive me. It's just a kind of a reaction I have when I start talking about these things. So we're going to start talking about advising the government. Now, how does the government get advice? Well, it gets advice, in my view, in two different ways. One is what I call inside advice, right? And there's some examples up there, full-time members of the administration. That is people who actually get paid for giving advice. And that is members of the cabinet, science advisor, you can all imagine other examples, heads of regulatory bodies and agencies, people at the Federal Reserve, and so on and so forth, the head of NIH. These are people who are full-time members of the administration, or they may be full-time members of the congressional staff and other agencies, and that's what I call inside advice. I've been working and giving sort of my own version of advice to the government for a long time because, as Ruth said, I began working in econometrics. You pronounce it very well. Congratulations. But what that was, we had a group at the University of Michigan, which I headed with a colleague. We built large econometric models to forecast economic activity. And so right from the very early stage of my career, I was giving advice to the government, but not inside advice. I've never worked full-time for the federal or the or state government, any other part of government. But then there's the outside advice. Now, what are outside advice? Well, the first thing that characterizes outside advice, you don't get paid for it, okay, because you're a volunteer. Someone calls you and says, would you be willing to spend an awful lot of time helping think about this and that problem? And by the way, we don't pay. We pay your train fare down to Washington or something, but that's the beginning and end of it. But there's a lot of volunteer advice given to the government. Who gives volunteer advice? There's various kinds of standing ad hoc committees of citizens and commissions and so on, and or anyone else. I mean, anyone can give advice. You open the paper, the government gets a lot of advice every day. And so I'm going to talk mostly about outside advice. That is how the government reaches out to essentially volunteers to give advice in various kinds of ways. Now, I have up there on the screen for you the special case of NAS. NAS is the National Academy of Sciences. Okay, a lot of advice on scientific matters goes through the National Academy of Science. And it's a kind of a mixed case because I'm right now heading a commission for the National Academy of Sciences on America's energy future. And we're still outsiders, that is, none of us are getting paid. However, the National Academy gets paid. They get paid by the government to carry out some of these studies and when the government thinks it's appropriate. But people like myself who are and other members of the commission and so on do not get paid. And so on issues that have a moral character or an ethical controversy, it's generally through outside advice that most of this takes place. Now, for example, in bioethics, if you look at the history of bioethics, where did the government get advice on these issues? There are really two places. There was some inside advice, generally through the National Institute of Health. The National Institute of Health has a bioethics division, which deals with protection of human subjects, other bioethical issues. And so you do have some inside advice on bioethics, but mainly all the principal bioethics advisory commissions, which go by somewhat different names, have really been in the category of outside advice. So we keep in mind as to whether when the government's getting advice, whether it's getting inside or outside advice. I'll come back to that in a little while. Now, there is a very distinctive nature of the U.S. advisory system. Again, I'm now talking about outside advisors, okay? It's different because our political setup is different. And the kind of outside advice, and the way it's organized and the way it's brought into the government is just somewhat different. What is characteristic about the U.S. political system as it relates to this? There are a lot of characteristics of the system I'm not going to talk about, but this is related to how you get outside advisory advice. First of all, you have cabinet members that are not elected. This is not unique, but it's not characteristic of the parliamentary system. Every cabinet member is elected. They may not be elected to be Secretary of State, but they are elected as a member of Parliament in the parliamentary system. And then the Prime Minister puts together his cabinet from those who were elected. The U.S. system is entirely different in that respect. These are people not elected. They're confirmed. It's true by the Senate in many cases, but they're not elected. Moreover, the top few layers of what I'll call the civil service, we don't use that name in this country. It has some kind of a bad sound in this country for some reason. It's not so true in other countries. But anyway, the top few layers of all the agencies are filled with political appointees. Okay? These are not, doesn't mean that they're incompetent in any way. It just means that they are filled, these are political decisions to who gets into these posts. Very often they have sometimes they'll have very important experience in this area. Often they have no experience in this area and in the particular areas, and therefore they become, as we'll see in a moment, dependent in some part, or more dependent in other places, on what I called outside advice. Then every commission, every congressional committee has its own set of advisory processes. I mean, the executive has its advisory groups, Congress has its advisory groups, holds its own hearings, and so on. And because you have distributed power between the executive branch and Congress, something which is not common in many other societies, this becomes a kind of vast interlocking set of moving bodies, all of whom are sort of channeling advice into the government one way or another, some to the congressional committee, some to the executive branch. And this whole thing put together results, in my opinion, on more dependence, or at least more use, of outside advice in the U.S. than is typical in most other places. And so it is a very distinctive system. Now, when we think about the nature of advice from so-called experts, who are called, we'll see in a moment whether we always have experts on these committees, or we have other kinds of people on these committees. The key issue always in my mind is to distinguish between the provision of sort of disinterested information versus advocacy. This is not an easy thing to do, and I'll come back in a moment to why you should all watch very carefully who it is that's on these commissions, how they get appointed, and so on. I'll come back to that issue. Because you would want to know, if you hear anybody say that some national commission has said this and that and the other thing, you would want to know, does this really qualify as sort of somewhat disinterested outside advice, or is this advocacy? And it's not always very easy to determine, and we'll come back to that as I talk about some particular issues. Now here is a point which I think is not often made, and you do want to provide policymakers, if you're in an advisory capacity, you want to provide policymakers with options, right? So for example, the National Bioethics Advisory Commission was dealing with the issue of cloning, or dealing with the issue of stem cell research, or dealing with the issue of, using people with mental disorders in medical experiments, other kinds of issues like that. What you want to do, or what you hope to do, is to be able to provide the government with a realistic set of options. Often, however, your most important job is to make sure that that you at least eliminate the obviously ridiculous options. In fact, you spend more time in these things eliminating ridiculous ideas than you do formulating positive ideas. So one of the main functions of many of these committees is actually to make sure Congress and the President doesn't go ahead with really silly ideas. And I can assure you that there are a dime a dozen every day. Every congressman, their staff, so on and so forth, whether it's in economics or bioethics, they get some idea, they put it in the mill some way, and you need somebody there just batting this stuff down every day, just so you're left with those options that really are maybe on different sides of an issue, but at least are coherent and thoughtful and might actually work over time. So you spend a surprising amount of time just batting down this stuff that actually can't work, won't work, and doesn't have any really logical coherence to it. But hopefully you also get an opportunity to provide those options which are viable on maybe perhaps more than one side of particular issues. Now, why should we appoint a national commission altogether? Why does the government need outside advice? Well, you could say, well, the top levels of what I call the civil service are filled with sometimes not very experienced people. And so, you have cabinet members, as I've looked at them over the years, all of whom are very intelligent and thoughtful people. I've never met one who isn't intelligent and thoughtful, but many of them have absolutely no experience in the area for which they are responsible. And moreover, there's no really very senior civil service underneath them. Underneath them are another set of appointees. You have to go down yet another level to get to some very talented people, but they're really farther away from the policymaking issues. If you compare that to let's say the parliamentary system, or the British system, the Canadian system, the Australian system, there are no political appointees below the cabinet member. Therefore, you have very senior, very knowledgeable civil service people who are often, in fact, believe they're the government rather than the people everybody elected. So you very often, I remember working in the Canadian government, very often people would talk to my minister as if it was my child, that they would sort of tell him what to do, and he wouldn't really have much to say about it. So there's arguments on both sides. But why, given that you do need to look for outside advice in this system, why appoint a national commission? Now let me give you a couple ideas of why you might want to appoint a national commission. This is the one people like myself like to believe, okay? The real reason is to bring expert, independent advice to key policymakers' issues of importance. Now, why do I like to believe that? Well, that makes me feel like I'm doing something important, and I'm not just wasting my time, and maybe someone will listen to me, from time to time, something might happen. That's what most of us tell ourselves, okay, that this is the reason. However, you have to be realistic. It often is not the reason. Let me suggest some others which are less flattering to those who are serving in these commissions, like myself. That is, you might appoint a commission to appear to be acting, right? Well, you don't really intend to take any actions at all, but you appear to be acting, you appear to do something, but you really don't have any serious intention at all of doing it. It's a way of just disguising something, pretending to do something. It may be to postpone or prevent the need to act. So, for example, in the case of cloning, after Dolly the sheep experiment was announced in Nature magazine, it seems a little quaint right now, but as some of you may remember, there was rather a lot of public hysteria. Within minutes, there were all kinds of bills in Congress about what to do, to criminalize it, not criminalize it, what kind of penalties. I mean, there were just a plethora of bills. And I really do believe that when President Clinton asked the National Bioethics Advisory Commission to look at that, one of his chief aims was to stymie all this congressional action. Just let it, he had a good argument. Some other people are going to look at this and report to us. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, but we had 90 days to report. And that was close enough so he got people in Congress to sit and wait. And I have to tell you, 90 days in the federal government, if you're advising the president, for example, is 60 days. Because it takes 30 days for your report to go through the various clearances, through the executive office building and so on. So we really had 60 days. I'll come back to that a little bit later. And sometimes just to appear presidential. You get a lot of smart people around and appear them. The president takes pictures and so on, and he has a moment of presidential appearance. There are other possibilities here. I'm not going to go into this any longer. But you just have, when you hear about a commission being appointed to deal with some controversial issue, you have to think about this. What is the real reason that this is being appointed? Unfortunately, the people like myself who may understand this in principle, when the event actually occurs, you really have no way of knowing, right? You get a call. It's very hard to get a call from the president and say, will you do this? And you say no, because you just want to appear presidential. You just can't say it, or at least I never had the nerve to say anything like that. And besides which, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't really know what the motives are. So it's only when you look back afterwards and see what's happened often can you make these judgments. Now, what should you watch when a committee is appointed, if it's something of interest to you? Watch the composition of the committee. Let me tell you how the National Bioethics Advisory Commission was formed. I got a call from President Clinton one day saying, would you agree to be chair of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission? I was sure he had made a mistake. I had never done any serious thinking in this area in my life. I couldn't imagine. So what was my explanation? My explanation myself was that the president had a list of names and phone numbers and tasks, and it was reading across here, or his secretary was reading across here, and they just slipped that was really intended for some other spot, was my idea. But I didn't have the nerve to say that or suggest this to the president. And so I said, could I call you back? Which always is a safe thing to say. And I talked around to my colleagues here and thought about it, and I called the science advisor, who I knew very well, and said, would you please find out if this is a mistake? I don't want to think about this. If it's a mistake. He called me back and some days later and said, no, it's not a mistake. They want you to do it. In the meantime, I talked to my colleagues here at Princeton who thought it might be a good idea. And that's how it happened. But when I was appointed chair, and this relates to the composition of the committee, I was given, you might say, a Chinese restaurant menu. I had, there was going to be 17 other members. So I had 17 rows, okay? And each row were 3 names, okay? And I could choose one name from each row, right? So it was pretty clear what they had in mind. One row just happened to be all nurses. Another row happened to be all theologians. Another row, moral philosophers. Others, people from sort of far away like Alaska, Hawaii, and so on. And some were all women, and et cetera, et cetera. It was quite clear that they had thought just what they wanted on here. And I just chose from each row one member. I don't know if that's a common thing or not, but that's what happened in that case. More importantly, who selects the agenda? If you're thinking about a committee, you would want to know who selects the agenda, who decides what it is they're going to work on. And probably the single most important thing is what authority the committee has. These are advisory committees. Okay? So they obviously don't have any authority to make laws or regulations or anything. They are purely advisory in nature. But they can have considerable influence in a number of ways. One, by the force of their ideas. That would be important. Second, who they report to. If you report to someone who really cares about this and has some power to do it. But one thing that's often very useful and often not followed often enough is that requiring federal agencies to respond to your report. Therefore, that prevents the report from just falling on the desk somewhere and disappearing into the many piles of reports that have been produced over the years. And so if I were to chair another commission or care about another commission or try to design a commission, I would absolutely insist that you have this forcing power. Not forced to do something, that's somebody else's business, but forced to get a response and a reaction to what it is that you've produced. Now, right now, I'm serving as an advisor to the transition team, to the Obama transition team, in the area of science policy and presidential commissions. And I don't know what they're going to do with whatever it is that I recommend, obviously, but it won't surprise you that one of the things I'll recommend is something like this forcing issue. Okay. Now, advice in the area of bioethics. The thing that you should remember always, I think, in the area of bioethics or anything that deals with issues of moral philosophy is the inevitable uncertainties that are involved. You are dealing in an area where nothing can be fully resolved in the sense of a compelling argument that will convince absolutely everybody who's willing to think carefully about an issue. Now, where do these uncertainties come from? Well, there's a number of ways to express this, but when time and other resources are finite, as it says up here, decisions must be made under conditions of uncertainty. I'll come back to that in the case of cloning. That is, in 90 days or 60 days, but even if you have 900 days and 600 days, there are certain amounts of uncertainty that you just have to deal with, and therefore it's always good to be very conscious of that in the area of bioethics. And that's explained by the second bullet here, that the human condition is always characterized by sufficient ambiguity that all important decisions contain elements of uncertainty. Okay? I think this is true in families. I think this is true in communities. I think this is true for the government. I think it's true for individuals. This is an aspect of the human condition which everybody understands. No one would argue with, I think, with this observation, but it's not oftenly observed. People behave as if that somehow there's a way to get rid of these important uncertainties. And I think certainly in the area of bioethics, or I think any area dealing with moral issues, that's really not possible. And so you have to live with this uncertainty and be able to operate within it. And I'll come back and give some examples in a few minutes. There's the moral and ethical uncertainty, which I want to emphasize since we're dealing with bioethics here today. In moral issues, for most part, there is no clear way of deciding with certainty which way is best. Moral philosophy is a retail business. Okay? Regardless of whether you're a Kantian or you're a utilitarian or you're a consequentialist or you're some other version of moral philosophy attracts you, there is no clear way of deciding which way is best. That's just in every single case. And so I often say it's a retail business. You've got to take individual circumstances, the context you find yourself in, what compelling arguments you can make, and see where you end up. But it's not like a scientific theory where you can say, my theory trumps your theory, it's more powerful, it's more economical in the sense of less complex, and it explains much more than your theory. Then you can say that theory replaces all the old ones are in the dustbin of history. Moral philosophy does not work that way. But there's a helpful analogy, at least I always felt, and I hope you don't think this is one I use with my students all the time. They always complain, if you can't be certain, what are we talking about in this course? How are we going to help ourselves? How are we going to help the government? And so I use this analogy, and I think it's a helpful analogy, namely that, no set of grammatical rules can tell you exactly how to write. Right? But that doesn't mean you can write any way you want. Right? You can't just string words together in an arbitrary fashion and say that's language. Okay? We know that's not possible. So you're always on a level of uncertainty. When you write and you try to express yourself in writing, when you write a book or any other document, okay, you have no absolute set of rules to rely on. Okay, you can express yourself in countless, infinite number of ways, and yet there are some things which are clearly wrong. So if you just string words arbitrarily together in a sentence, no one will accept that. And I think in moral philosophy and ethical issues, it's very much the same. Yes, there are different ways to look at it, but some ways are clearly wrong. And you can often eliminate those ways, but you're still going to be left with a certain amount of uncertainty. Now let's get to advice, as I said right at the beginning, on controversial issues. How do controversial issues usually get settled in life? Well, sometimes it can be settled by scientific facts or scientific knowledge. There are some issues, what temperature does water boil, and we can get much more complex examples, which really can be settled. Okay, we know that they can be settled by appealing to scientific knowledge of one kind or another, and that will settle arguments about certain kinds of issues. There's some controversial issues that can be settled by clarification. That is probably a very underestimated strategy. Many moral arguments really continue because people just don't clarify what they mean carefully. And so the first thing you do when you have a moral argument is try to clarify the issue you're talking about. And it is surprising the number of times you can get quite a long way just by clarifying the issue, and you can bring people quite along who in the end might disagree because there are some fundamental differences between them, but they can get quite a long way by clarification, and sometimes by compelling moral arguments. There are occasional cases where most people agree that this is right and that is wrong. But then they cease to be controversial. Okay? So if you have a controversial issue, you can't settle it. A controversial moral issue can't be settled by scientific knowledge, can't be settled by clarification or ethical arguments. How do you settle it then? And if you're going to be forming public policy, you have to have a policy, right? You can't just throw your hands up and say, we have no policy, and maybe we'll settle the issue. We're fundamentally disagreed. Okay? They can only be settled, as this says, by politics or procedural issues, other kinds of procedural issues. Politics, after all, is a procedural way to decide something, right? You have a vote somehow, and you say, we don't know what's the right thing to do, but whatever the vote is, that's what we do. It's a procedural issue, and very often in moral arguments, people can't agree, but they may agree in a procedure. They may agree, well, let's follow this procedure, and whatever the outcome is, that'll happen. But more importantly, it can only be settled, a lot of these arguments will only be settled by politics, and I think in bioethics, that's generally the case. Let's talk about cloning, because I think it illustrates some of these things. I won't go through this, because this is not meant to be a lecture on the science, but I just want to remind you what human reproductive cloning is. It's done through a technique called somatic cell nuclear transfer, where an enucleated ova, that is an ova where you take the genetic material out, and you receive the nucleus of a somatic cell from presumably someone else, and then the whole thing is activated and fertilized and so on, and it can be implanted, and a clone can result. Let's see. Okay. Now, the Dolly experiment and the public response. I've already mentioned this. I'm not going to take time on it right now. The Dolly experiment, everyone in this room just glancing around was an adult when the Dolly experiment happened. And it is really amazing when you look back and read the newspaper what hysteria was around. It's very hard for us to understand. It was very hard for the commission to understand at that time where the hysteria came from. But there was an enormous amount of hysteria, and that's what caused the president to ask to get a report so quickly out to them. Okay. And he asked NBAC, the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, to report within 90 days. And I said that meant 60 days. And you have to understand the fact that we had scientists on the NBAC commission. So one of those roles, a couple of those roles were for scientists, geneticists, and other scientists. Some of those scientists wasn't sure that this was biologically possible. As a matter of fact, even weeks later, when I gave a talk at Rockefeller University in New York, someone got up, I'm told, a very well-known biologist, got up and said, well, this is just can't happen, didn't happen, there must be something wrong with the experiment. So and biologists should have known better, because early experiments in the 1960s by John Groden at the University of Nevada, dealing at that time with frogs, really showed that cloning of animals was possible. Okay, and using this somatic cell nuclear transfer technique. What this technique relies on is that every cell in your body has all the genetic material you need. Okay, that's what this technique relies on. And he had shown that for frogs, not for humans, and indeed not for primates, but he showed it for frogs. So it shouldn't have been a surprise, but it was a surprise even to at least the scientists in our commission, which I thought of as very distinguished scientists. I hope I wasn't wrong in that case. But anyways, we had to report in 90 days. I'll tell you in a few moments, I'm not going to talk on it now, how we responded to that. And then I'm also going to speak a little bit about what happened in the U.S. and internationally after our advice, and how the regulation of reproductive cloning, and this is assisted reproductive technologies that have gone on since then. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, what do you do when you're a commission? There wasn't a single commissioner who understood that on day one understood what cloning was. Okay, no one. We all showed up there, and no one could stand up and give a coherent account of what this scientific technique was. Okay, that's where we started. We had this 60-day deadline sitting out in front of us. Well, of course, the first thing we did is get some education. Right? We invited a number of scientists in at our next meeting. We scheduled extra meetings. We invited some scientists in. It actually wasn't that hard to understand. We thought it was going to be hard. It was actually pretty easy to understand, but it took us probably 2-3 meetings till we could talk, like we sort of halfway understood what we were saying, after essentially we went back to school. We went to school on reproductive cloning and what this was. But it's clear to us that in that time interval, we had no way that we could deal with all the issues. There were just too many issues to deal with. So we had to do some tactical, we had to say, what are our tactics? How are we going to approach this problem? How can we make this problem small enough to deal with in 60 days, which is really what we had. So the question is, that means you had to take certain issues and put them aside. You just weren't going to deal with them at this particular time. Because philosophy and moral reasoning was not enough. We could not get to an answer just by using a moral philosophy, because different theories gave different results. Whether if you were someone attached to natural law, you got one result. You were attached to utilitarianism, you got another result. They're both coherent and thoughtful. And even when we talked about theologians, one of the first things we did is invite in members of the major religious faiths in this country and ask them what they thought about this. And that was actually an extremely interesting exercise. We got a lot of criticism at the time because people told us that, it's a public body, there's a separation of church and state. Why are you having these rabbis, priests, bishops, etc., come in to talk to you? Well, the answer is there's no reason why we couldn't use and even be inspired by the way they thought about this problem, but we couldn't obviously base our recommendations on on some particular holy text, because that's not appropriate for a public body. It was extremely interesting what they had to say. And when we surveyed people around the country, it was clear that most of them turned to their pastors to find out how they should think about this. So we said, well, we better listen to what these people have to say. And my favorite incident in this whole thing, and it was very inspiring, was two things that struck me. One, some religions had a kind of intellectual history in this area. Now, how could they have an intellectual history in this area? They didn't know any more about cloning than I knew a few months before this. Where did they get it from? Well, they had thought about very unusual births. And it sounds a little unusual to the modern ear, but they had thought about what happens when a devil marries an angel, or something else. You could make up your own example. Well, however that sounds to us, they had thought about these things and had a kind of intellectual framework for how they would work themselves through, and it was really kind of interesting. But one day, I guess we had 2 days of hearings from dealing with the major religions. We didn't do them all, the major religions in this country. And it ended up on the second day. It turned out that the representative of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops was speaking, and I can't remember, but right next to, either before or after, I don't remember, was a representative of Orthodox Judaism. They both started off with the most obvious verse in the Bible. That is, I don't remember what day, when God created the earth, and then he declares that human beings have some kind of sovereignty over the fish that fly, the fish that swim, the birds that fly, etc. And it was often interpreted historically that this meant that there was a moral superiority of humankind compared to other living things. It's often interpreted that way. And both of these major religions interpreted it that way, and they both started with that phrase from Genesis, and then they said, yes, that's what the term is, the fact that human beings are more superior than others. And then they went entirely different ways. The Orthodox Judaism interpretation was, as explained to us, that this was in fact the first commandment. And so the issue was not whether, the question was only a question of motivation. That is, you were not only, that if you could do things using non-human animals, non-human life, and so on. If the motivation was good, you were commanded to do it, if this was to benefit humankind. It was sort of a commandment. The Catholic interpretation was just exactly opposite of that, and their long intellectual tradition was to decide there's certain things only reserved for God. Other things, if you could do them or not, doesn't matter. It was sinful for human beings to engage in, so to speak, godlike activity. And I don't want to comment, and I'm not competent to comment on those particular theological views, but the point is that looking at moral philosophers or theologians, we could not get any agreement or really any advice on what to do. So we had to try to go with this, try to find some other tactical ways. And as I've already mentioned, I'm not going to spend any time on it now, there are ways to settle scientific differences which aren't available in moral philosophy. So what other resources were available? Well, the first thing we did is it said we're going to ignore the constitutional issue. What would be the constitutional issue in cloning? Why should cloning be a constitutional issue? Anybody want to guess? Why on earth do we have to think even 5 minutes about whether we're going to deal with the Constitution?
Can a clone person vote?
Well, that would be one possibility. But think about, and that's interesting, that's not the way I thought about it at the time, or we thought about it at the time. What we thought about was the Supreme Court had generally put a sort of a fence of privacy around reproductive rights. Right? There have been a series of Supreme Court decisions over the last 30 or 40 years which says the way people choose to reproduce is their own business. Okay, we can't, as the phrase goes, be in the bedroom or some other phrase of that kind. And so we asked ourselves, well, what about cloning? Would this fall inside the fence of reproductive freedom in which the states would not be allowed to write laws, or the federal government not be allowed to write a law? Or is cloning so fantastically unusual that it would be outside the fence and the states and or the federal government could in fact write laws? However, we decided we didn't have time to think about that issue, so we put it aside. We ignored the issues of social justice that might be involved. People are always concerned about new techniques. That maybe only rich people could afford cloning, and maybe they would only clone rich people, or so on, all those kind of social justice issues, which are not to be laughed at and all, but we just decided we had no time to deal with that, so we put aside social justice. As you're going to see in a minute, we had very little left in the end. Then we said, we're going to ignore, this is rather more interesting, we decided to ignore the accumulative evidence about twin studies. After all, what are clones? Clones are a certain kind of delayed twin, right? It's a genetic twin, sort of born 20 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later. And so there must be some insights, some ideas you can gain about what this might mean to humankind by a long series of twin studies. But once again, we had, taking you back to 60 days, we had no time to think about that or do that literature, so we decided we're going to ignore that. And then this is something which came back a little bit to haunt us, and embryo research was already this is before stem cell research, but research on before stem cells, we knew about human embryonic stem cells, but human embryonic research had been around for a long time, and it was always very controversial, as was the treatment of non-human animals. And we said, well, this is amongst the things we're going to ignore, that we're not going to touch that issue for now and come back to it later. Now, this exercise, however humorous it appears to me quite humorous right now, frankly, but nevertheless, you are really compelled to go through this when you're operating under deadlines of the kind. You've got to get the problem defined in a way that you can deal with it, and you have some capacity to deal with it. And so, what we did understand very easily, this took us about 3 days to agree to, that reproductive cloning is medically dangerous. Okay, and both for the mother and the fetus, and should be legally banned for now. That actually was a very easy decision for us to come to. Safety is a moral issue. There are enormous safety concerns here. If any of you had ever read the how many tries you have to go through to get a live birth and so on, and we had no idea about other kind of more subtle implications that were very difficult. So it was very easy to decide that it was medically dangerous and would be inappropriate for the moment. And then we had, our second issue was relax the ban if, etc. I won't read that whole thing to you. A whole set of other things have to be satisfied. I don't want to go through it all right now. You can read that. And that was basically our recommendation. Now, what happened to our recommendation? Well, the president introduced legislation. I mean, this was, at least for all advisory commissions I was on, this was got a lot of fanfare around there. Vivian was with me at this time. We had a press conference in the Rose Garden, and he announced what he was going to receive the report, announced what he was going to do, introduced legislation to follow our report. Now, the legislation, the federal legislation, never went anywhere then and hasn't gone anywhere since. That is, there is no federal legislation on cloning as we sit here now. The more interesting thing was many countries around the world copied our report. If you look at language in some of the rules, regulations, and legislation enacted abroad, the language comes directly from the report, often verbatim, often without realizing that some of these words don't apply to those governments because it was made for this particular purpose. And so, but actually from that day to this, which is now a decade or more, there's been no action in the federal government. Why is that? Why does there no action by the federal government in this area? There have been actions in some of the states. Very few, but some of the states have taken action. Why is that? Nobody have any guess? Think of reproductive areas. What is the most controversial political issue in our country? Pro-life, pro-choice, or choice, pro-life, whatever. That is controversial, completely unresolved. And this kind of recommendation, this kind of area just attracts amendments. And attracts enough amendments so that you really can't get the legislation done. And that leads to another issue that I want to really emphasize, that on many controversial issues, Congress is paralyzed. And eventually the courts make decisions. That's really very, very different in other countries. Very often, Congress gets paralyzed, whether it's on cloning or whether it's on physician-assisted suicide, a lot of these very controversial issues. The Congress is just unable to act. Take affirmative action. How did affirmative action get started in this country? Why do we have any rules with respect to affirmative action in this country? How did that get started? Well, the Supreme Court allowed it, but it got started by executive order. Okay? The president, starting with Nixon on, issued executive orders saying if you receive federal funds of any kind, you have to behave in this way. Congress has never been able to pass anything comprehensive in affirmative action because it's just too controversial. And the courts, you're quite right, the courts chime in again to tell you what you're allowed to do, not allowed to do. But we have this very interesting phenomenon in this country that on morally controversial issues, it's often very hard for Congress to act. And so the states start acting, or some states start acting, or the courts act in one way or another, that depends on someone bringing a case. And whether they bring it in the state court or they bring it in the federal court. Take cloning. Would you bring that in the state court or a federal court? If you want to. You bring in state court, family law, right? That's where cloning would more naturally fit, as would other reproductive things. The Supreme Court can declare those state issues either constitutional or not, depending on the case. And so really it's gone nowhere regarding our own federal government. Now you put the resources together, you can have human reproductive cloning tomorrow if you think you can do it. As far as the government rules and regulations, you can just go ahead and do it. Now, that's not true internationally. And here, just as some brief information on what's happening in different countries, cloning is a very slippery word. Cloning is done all the time in biological libraries. It's human reproductive cloning that's controversial. Okay, and so scientists don't like it when I don't talk very carefully about that. But as I said at the bottom here, silence in the U.S. and in other countries has been silence too. Now, you've had a lot of discussions about human embryonic cell. I think the last session you had was on human embryonic cell by someone who's really extremely competent in that area. This is an interesting area. I'm not going to talk about the science here, which you've already heard of. I'm just going to have a very few things to say about this. That is, why is there all a fuss? You heard about that last week. I'm not going to go through that. That is, you have all those possibilities in biomedical science, some of which are seem very close to fruition and so on. That was last week, or I don't know how long ago that was, but the last lecture in this series that you had here. So, and of course, the ethical and moral concerns are simply the whether or not you can destroy an embryo regardless of what the purpose is, whether that's homicide or something else, is an ongoing issue. But the response here was kind of interesting. President Clinton, when we gave our report was that you ought to be allowed to both create and use human embryonic cells. But we had only one condition, that it had to come, this is very common now, it had to come from embryos which were created for a reproductive project. So it's the so-called excess embryos. And we thought that we restricted, and now why did we restrict it to excess embryos? Frankly, the committee as a committee was willing to say, any way you want to produce this is fine with them. Okay, that whether you want to have, you can get donated sperm and ova and make it just for research purposes. You can do it through somatic cell nuclear transfer cloning. There's all kinds of ways you can do it. The committee's real opinion was any way is okay. And you should be able to create them and use them. And we thought the interaction between both creating and using at that time in the science was very important. Clinton rejected part of that proposal. He said it was okay to use federal funds to do research with human embryonic cells, but not to make them. Now, what do you think of that as a moral argument? What's the moral status of that position? It's like a don't ask, don't tell thing, right? As long as someone presents you with the human embryonic cells, you can use them, but you can't make them. So you don't ask where it comes from. Okay? What is that? Does that seem like a coherent moral position to some of you? It's like having a hitman, right? You hire a hitman to do something, and then you say, well, you're absolved, you didn't actually do it. He or she did it. That was essentially, in my view, the basis of the Clinton policy. It sounded sort of like a compromise, but in fact, I think it was morally not a very coherent policy. The Bush policy, which was much more restrictive than the Clinton policy, was actually morally more coherent. Whatever you might think about it, whether you like it or dislike is another matter, was morally more coherent, because he said we did not want to be involved with federal funds either for the creation or use of these things. If things have already been created as of this and that date, there's nothing we can do about it. Go ahead and use them, and so on. It was actually more, although more restrictive, and I don't like his policy, it was actually more morally coherent as far as I could tell. And there's, of course, as you know, all kinds of developments in various state laws, including here in New Jersey. I'm going to conclude, because I think I've gone on long enough, talking about the role of the states. It's an interesting thing that state actions can stimulate a demand for federal action by both sides of the argument. Take the environmental case, which is the most straightforward case. California passes a law on greenhouse gas emissions of some kind, the automobiles, let's say. Well, the automobile industry doesn't like it that much, but there California has passed the law. Then Illinois passes a slightly different law. And Texas a somewhat different law. This is something the automobile industry just cannot deal with. So all of a sudden you find both environmentalists and, in this case, the automotive countries encouraging the federal government to take this over and at least have one law here so we can figure out what to do. So state action can be very important, not only in its own right, because people in California might feel a certain way, or in New Jersey or wherever, but in fact, you can get a sort of what I call a kind of a policy sweet spot here, when both sides of the argument want the federal government to do something. They may want to do something different. They may have different ideas what they should do, but it may generate a demand on all sides of an argument for federal legislation. And I think that often happens, and so very often the states can play a very important role in inducing both sides to come to the table in Washington and to get something done. That's happened in all the Clean Air Acts that the federal government has passed, which are quite a number since the mid-1960s and very effective. My view is it's going to happen in a lot of these greenhouse gas emissions before very long. The states, you'll see, will be the first actor. They've already acted. I mean, the Northeast states have acted in some way. California has acted in another way. And whether you're in the power industry or whether you're an environmental action group, you're going to want the federal government to get into this act and do something so it'll be coherent and we could all understand whether it's working or not. So the states can be very important. This is especially so, of course, anything dealing with families, because as you know, state law governs family law. And that's just a mixture. So what I would like to leave you with is a couple of things to remember. One thing, when you're dealing with morally controversial issues, uncertainty characterizes everything you do. You have to look, if you can, to find a public policy when people are divided on a public policy issue. What you try to do is find a spot where you've got to come down on one side or the other, right? You can't have it both ways. But you try to find a spot which might signal to the losing side that you heard them, you respect them, they are as worthy a moral person as you are, but you've just come down in a different place. That was what was behind our recommendation to use only excess embryos. We hoped it might signal to some people on the other side that, we heard them, we understood their arguments, we didn't agree with them, but we understood them and we respected them as moral individuals as much as we respected ourselves, but we came down in a different way. So it's very important to try to find those signals if you can. You can't always find some signals, but if you can find some signals, you take the pro-life, pro-choice argument, and I certainly don't want to get off onto that issue right now, but there are things that you can do to signal the other side that you heard some of their argument, whether it's restrictions on when abortions will be allowed, first trimester, second, third, et cetera, et cetera. There are ways to function this, to sort of go one way, but signal the other side you heard them. In a democracy, this is extremely important. So you try to look, you have to deal with uncertainty, you can't get around that. You try to look in public policy areas for signals that said signals to the losing side. If you can't find those signals, well, you can't, but at least you try to do them. And that you hope over time, just like when you're disappointed in an election, you wait for the next time. You don't sort of stamp your feet and walk out of the country or something like that. And so what you hope in these cases also, the people say, well, I lost this time, but there was a signal there. Someone understood what I had to say. Someone respected me even if they disagree with me. And that's very important. You don't have to disrespect someone because you disagree with them. And in that way, hopefully, we can all learn to live with this and have these things evolve over time. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the dynamics of the committee vote, as it were? What were your rules about the number of votes required to make a recommendation? Were there dissenting opinions that were passed on, which the so-called advice?
We decided that we would not insist on total agreement. And in fact, it's my own belief that if you insist on total agreement, one, you don't tend to end up in the right place and you hide important amounts of information. And so we said we wouldn't require a unanimous vote on anything. It turned out we very often did have unanimous opinions, but it wasn't because we decided it that way. For example, let's take anything that deals with embryos, just to take these more extreme examples. We had people on the committee who were, let's say, they were pro-life in the sense that that's what they believed. It turned out the people on our committee who believed that very strongly didn't think it was a public policy matter. So that made it, that was just happenstance. I don't think anybody knew that at the beginning. One of the things I know about myself, when you ask, what did President Clinton know about my view on pro-life, pro-choice? Well, he couldn't have known. I never said anything about it. At least I had one good quality. I didn't talk about things I hadn't thought about. And so at least I hadn't talked about it. So he couldn't possibly have known where I was. He may have made a guess, but he couldn't have known. And whether in these rows that he gave us, there were some people he knew were pro-life and some he knew were pro-choice, I have no idea. But we worked very well. We had a committee, which is, I think, just one of those serendipitous things they had. They were tremendously intellectually generous to each other. And to me, I was the least steeped in bioethics by far of all the people on the committee who had spent their lifetime in this area. And they were genial and got along. So we never really had a tough decision in that area. The toughest one I remember was when it was not in any of these things that are surrounded cloning and stem cells. It was when we looked at the issue of when you could use people with mental disorders in medical experiments. And some people thought that they didn't disagree with the proposed rules we came out with, But they thought, look, it's true that when you're dealing with people with mental disorders, they can't really serve their own interests. They can't protect their own interests when they want to enter experiments. And so you have to find some other way to get them into the experiment, whether it's a guardian or something else like that. You have to have various kinds of procedures to do it. Psychiatrists, particularly, really disliked this because they said, they're justifiably, they said, look, there's lots of people who find themselves unable to defend their own interests. Someone's in an accident, they're taken to the emergency room, they can't defend their own interests either. Why did you focus on mental disorders? Aren't you kind of just sort of focusing on a group which already has enough trouble? They don't need any more focus from anyone. And I understood that argument, and on the committee, that was controversial. We eventually just, the other way you can sometimes reach agreement is by exhaustion. And I think in that case we may have gotten exhausted on that issue. But we didn't have any formal rules. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming. Have a great Thanksgiving.